Welcome back to Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher, where we explore what trust is, why it matters, and how to build it. In today's video, we're exploring another theory of trust from the philosophical canon. But today, we're exploring the one true correct theory, mine. Yes, today we'll be taking a look at the account that I've defended in my research, and there I've called the ought account of trust, for reasons that will become abundantly clear pretty shortly. To introduce the theory, we can use two examples. For the first, imagine a case of getting into the car. When you get in and buckle your seatbelt, you don't consciously test the seatbelt or question its reliability. You simply trust that the seatbelt will restrain you in the event of a crash. This trust involves trusting the object to function correctly, based on an underlying belief that it was properly manufactured, maintained, and tested, and all those sorts of things. Now compare that to another case of trust. In this second case, that of me trusting my wife to save me the last of the biscuits from the packet. To be sure, in this case, I also don't test that or question anyone's reliability. I simply trust that she will save me the biscuit, whether I'm right to do so or wrong to do so. Now, while both cases involve untested reliance, only the second carries the emotional and moral vulnerability that seems to define so much of what we mean by trust in its interpersonal form. If the seatbelt fails, well, it's a malfunction. When the biscuit is gone, well, that might feel like a betrayal. Now, it might seem tempting to say that what we have here is a difference between trust and reliance. The first case, involving the car seatbelt, is nothing more than a simple case of relying on something. It's not really trust. And the second case is. And we can differentiate between them on the basis that the case involving the biscuits has a moral dimension. Well, we could do that. But a proponent of the ought account is likely to push back. After all, aren't these both trust? For sure, we might think there's no moral dimension to the seatbelt case, but how much does that matter to whether what we have here really is or really isn't trust? We certainly talk of trusting inanimate objects all of the time, even if there is in fact no moral dimension to those cases of trust. And if we speak in that way, talk in that way, and that's some evidence that we really think in that way, and that there is trust in those cases. And if we have trust in both cases, in the moral case and the non-moral case, then our theory of trust really should reflect that. Now, some theories will struggle to do that. For some theories of trust build into them that trust is fundamentally interpersonal and fundamentally has that moral dimension. For instance, if we follow Catherine Hawley in treating trust as involving relying on someone for something, and they're thinking that means that they have a specific commitment to delivering that thing, well, I just don't think that seatbelts have any commitment at all. So that can't be trust, according to Hawley. But I think it really might be a case of trust. After all, again, we speak that way and we talk that way. So what does the ought account of trust actually say? Well, if we want to get our philosophical nerd on, it says, X trusts Y to phi, if and only if X believes that Y ought to phi, and relies upon Y to phi. As ever, we can use an example to illustrate. So suppose a parent X trusts a babysitter Y to pick up their child from school. That action there is phi. The parent believes that the babysitter ought to pick up the child, not just as a practical task, but as a moral or role-based obligation. The babysitter agreed to do it, and the child's well-being depends on it. So the parent sees that as something the babysitter should. At the same time, the parent relies upon the babysitter to actually do it. They don't make backup plans, call a taxi just in case, or show up themselves. The parent structures their day around the assumption that the babysitter will follow through. So, the parent believes the babysitter ought to do the task, and the parent relies on the babysitter to do it. And therefore, on the ought account, the parent trusts the babysitter to pick up the child. That's how we could illustrate the theory. Now, that's all well and good, but how does that help us with the case of trusting the seatbelt? Let's think about it. In the seatbelt case, you clearly rely on the seatbelt to function. You buckle it without testing it and you expect it to protect you in the event of a crash. But do you believe that the seatbelt ought to protect you? Now, here's where I think it gets fun. In a sense, no. You clearly don't do that morally. You don't think that the seatbelt morally ought to protect you. Most of us don't think that seatbelts are moral agents. And if you do, we should perhaps have a different conversation. But we do think that seatbelts ought to do things in a predictive sense. So instead of interpreting X believes that Y ought to phi as a moral or normative obligation, we can interpret it as something else. Perhaps something a little bit like given how things usually go, why oughtify? That's what typically happens. So the seatbelt ought to protect me. That's what typically happens. And this predictive ought isn't about what should happen in any kind of moral or duty-bound sense, but it's about instead what's expected to happen based on precedent, design, habit, or statistical regularity. We can apply all of this back to the seatbelt case. You rely on the seatbelt to restrain you in a crash, and you believe that the seatbelt ought to function properly in the sense that it's designed to and usually does. On this view, trust in the seatbelt is trust in a system that behaves predictably in a certain kind of way. You're not imputing moral obligations to the seatbelt, but through the ought, you're still attaching something in the sense of this is what should happen based upon how the world is supposed to work. And this is why, or at least it's one of the reasons, that I really like the ought account of trust. Because ought here can function in different kinds of ways. Sometimes normative and moral, and sometimes not. And that means that the theory serves to capture the fact that sometimes our trust has a moral dimension, as in the biscuit case, and sometimes it does not, as in the seatbelt case. Now, for sure, there may be other things that can go wrong and right with the view, but that's at least one reason to like it. And if you're interested in following up on the theory, you can check out the link below that will take you to the research paper. But for now, that's it. Until next time, you really ought to stay suitably trusting.